الفاتحة على ما نوى أسلافنا الصالحين إلى حضرة سيدنا وحبيبنا وشفيعنا رسول الله محمد بن عبد الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه من والاه وإلى روح الأئمة المجتهدين والعلماء العاملين وصوفية المحققين وأهل الذكر والتوحيد ومشايخ هذه الأمة بأن الله يتغشاهم بالرحمة والمغفرة ويعني درجاتهم في الجنة وينفعنا بأسرارهم وأنوارهم وعلومهم ونفحاتهم في الدين والدنيا والآخرة. الفاتحة. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Alhamdulillah. Today we begin our first discussion, a very basic introduction on the history of Western philosophy, compressed over, inshallah, tentatively over 4 meetings. So I can only cover, and that's why I decided to call it the history of the general movements, or the general movements in the history of Western philosophy, so that you at least understand the history of Western thought in the rough outlines. Out of these fundamentals, you can then develop yourselves, develop your understanding in this regard. So the plan of the course is to cover the major periods. The first period is the Greek, the Hellenic/Hellenistic period. There's a fine distinction between these two terms, yes, Hellenic and Hellenistic. Hellenic refers to the Greek period of philosophy, roughly from 6th century BC. Let's just say to the time of Aristotle, because after Aristotle, although there were other philosophers who were Greek speaking, I think it culminated with Aristotle. After that, I think at some point the Greeks were being conquered by the Romans, and then began a new era whereby philosophy was conducted in Latin, but using Greek thought, using Greek foundations. So amongst those who were the second period, they would be called the Hellenistic philosophers. Amongst these, the chief schools were the Stoics, Epicureans, the Skeptics, and the Neoplatonists. Yes, these were the major schools of the Hellenistic period. So the first ones, that means to say, coming from the 6th century BC, according to the historian of philosophy Wilhelm Windelband, himself being a neo-Kantian, a 19th century/20th century historian of philosophy, who wrote a very good 2-volume work on the history of philosophy. According to him, the Hellenic period in philosophy can roughly be divided into 3 major periods. Can you see if I... Maybe why don't you come forward, yeah, so that you can see. There is in the history of Western philosophy, or in the Greek philosophy, 3 periods, according to his division. The cosmological period, this included the from Thales, Anaximenes, Anaximander, to the Parmenides and Heraclitus. So in the cosmological period, the concern of philosophy was chiefly cosmological. That means to say they were thinking about the cosmos, the build-up of the universe. They were philosophizing using some foundational matter that they thought would ground the entirety of reality, until they reach, I suppose, perfection in these 2 scholars, Parmenides and Heraclitus. Because by the time that it reached Parmenides and Heraclitus, by now they were conceiving about being. The one of them thought that there was permanence in being and existence, and the other one thought that change was the underlying reality. constant change. So this was the first period. The second period refers to what we would call the anthropological period, in which after a lot of, shall we say, attempts at trying to conceptualize reality, they recognize, for example, Socrates himself, they recognized that there were so many ways that they could have conceptualized reality without the one being, that means to say, without any definitive answers. So as a result, they decided to focus their discussions on the human. So during this period, the two major representatives were the Sophists and Socrates. Yes, we will talk about them more later. That means to say, those who made human being, man, the center of their philosophy. And then finally, you have the systematic period. This represented by Plato, Aristotle, and Democritus, who conceived of an atomistic conception of the world. Okay. Now, what led to the birth of philosophy in its brilliance and its, shall we say, scientific tradition in the West? Well, according to Francis Cornford, yes, one of their historians of ideas, he has a book called From Religion to Philosophy. In that work, he tried to argue that the roots of philosophy, at least in the Greek sense, was their religion. Of course, their religion at that time consisted of mythologies, consisted of ideas, and their religion had this epistemology whereby they affirmed that the poets were somehow divinely inspired when they wrote some of their poetry. So basically, cosmology developed out of theogony. Theogony is a discipline of knowledge whereby you try to come up with stories referring to gods and goddesses pertaining to the origins of the world. Where theogony is concerned, there is almost a marked resemblance between what the Greeks, early Greeks, thought of, as well as the Nordic sagas, as well as what is taught in ancient Egypt in terms of the mythologies. That means to say, there is some sort of marked agreements between one mythological system and another. There's some minor changes, but overall there is some story about stories about how the world came about. So, however, from this theogony and from the poetry of the poets, what happened was that, according to Cornford, and Professor Al-Attas also writes this in the Risalah untuk kaum Muslimin, despite their trust of the poets, what had happened was a degeneration in the morality of the people. And when there was a degeneration in the morality of the people, it became projected unto their religion also. So with moral degeneration, yes, whereby they had to propitiate the gods and so on, religion became a matter of festivity. According to Nietzsche, during that time there were two currents. There was the current of rational reason, and this in his book called The Birth of Tragedy, his first book, written when he was a professor, I think, at Basel in Germany. So he said that there were two currents. One is the current of Apollo, that means to say cool reason, represented by Socrates and Plato. The other is represented by Dionysius, the god of excess, the god of festivities. Yes, the god whose culmination would be in the orgy. So the Greek at that time was torn between reason and this excess of, shall we say, ghadab and shahwa in that sense. And that excess led them it became reflected in their mythologies also. Because we don't know about because as we look at the Homer's Iliad, yeah, in the poetry of the Greeks that was meant to be sacred, we see there in the personalities of the gods only immortals, much more stronger than human beings, but yet in terms of morality not really worthy of respect, because the gods would fight amongst themselves, they would steal and cheat, they would descend upon the earth and forcefully take brides and have illegitimate children with women in this world. And then there were gods who represented, they were puny, they were resentful. All the gods did not represent a sort of moral high ground, to such an extent that in some of the dialogues of Plato, you will find, for example, in the Euthyphro, whereby Plato challenges, whereby it became Euthyphro's dilemma became possible, in which it is said there, one of the questions of the dilemma that persists well into Christianity is the question of whether something is good because the gods desire it, or do the god desire it because it is good. That means to say, is goodness as a category independent of the evaluation of the gods? Why is this possible? Because the question can be posed because the gods did not appear to be very moral. And Plato wanted to say, so his solution was that goodness must be independent of the gods, because the gods did things which were not good. But in order to buttress that kind of question, because it will raise a sort of revulsion amongst the people, he also posed another question. What if between one god and another, say between Zeus and Poseidon, they both desired different things? Which one is the good then? So that's a clever way of saving himself. That means to say that it is not that he is trying to challenge the status quo. He is merely asking a question to say that for the sake of being pious, which of the gods do they follow? And this is a problem which is particular to polytheism. But even well into Christianity, this Euthyphro's dilemma can still be posed because of the ethnic creations and inventions that went into the writings of the Old Testament, such that somehow they thought that independently of the desires of God is the criteria of goodness. And unfortunately, this Euthyphro's dilemma sometimes seep through the Muslim minds also in our times. They also want to pose a similar question, as if to say that they can discover goodness independently of religion. As if to say that then begins their line of thought where you need to reinterpret religion, because they thought that goodness is independent of the evaluation of a God. Without forgetting that the genealogy of this question came as a result of the corruption of religion in the Greek sense. So when religion became corrupted, morality, which is because the Greeks had already an understanding of what is called the nomos. That means to say the laws governing the universe, the logos also. They understood that there is a fine system of mathematics whereby things do not contradict each other. So therefore, when it comes to their religion, with these fundamental dilemmas, as a result, the gods became banished. Yes, the gods, to use a literary expression, was banished from Mount Olympus. Of course, when you go to Greece and you go to the Mount Olympus, don't say that. Were there gods before they were banished? When they say banished, that means to say banished from their worldview. Yes, it wasn't like there was an actual process yang mana they deconsecrated the temples or anything. It's just that from their worldview, it became secularized. And it is likened to the process of Islamization also. That means to say the removal of false gods, the removal of false magical type of belief. Because in the mythological kind of reasoning, what was important was not whether or not it in fact happened, but whether or not it made sense in the literary sense. So, as we said just now, from the things, as a result of the birth of philosophy, that means to say the birth of scientific and rational reasoning, the gods were banished from their worldview. But with the banishment of the gods, some of the basic categories of religion still remain. One of the things, one of the concepts that became the ground of philosophy included what is called moira. That means to say a sort of rule, a legal rule. Yes, out of this they developed it, yes, into philosophy. Yes. So during the cosmological period, from Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, these were the Ionians and the Milesians. Yes. Philosophy did not start in Magna Graecia, that means to say in Greater Greece. It started in the islands of Ionia. That's why the Arabs, the Muslim philosophers, they call them Yunaniyun. Yes, Yunani from Ionia. Yes, they didn't call them Hellenistic or Hellenic. In fact, some of the terms, for example, to refer to Aristotle and his school, he was referred to as the Mashaiyun, the Peripatetics, referring to the act of walking while teaching. While the Stoics, I think it's very interesting how they Arabized it. They called the Stoics the Ustukussa. Yes. And Socrates, Sukra. Hippocrates, Bukra. And Plato, they added in front, Aflatun. For a more, shall we say, a revisionist conception of this thesis that I have propounded, you should read Dr. Adi Sutya's master's thesis on the genesis of, is it science in Greek thought? So basically, he used Islamic sources in addition to the other revisionist histories of Greek philosophy to suggest an alternative thesis. Rather, it would enrich the Comfort's thesis because it doesn't negate Comfort's thesis that Greek philosophy came as a result of the corruption of Greek religion that made them conceptualize within a secular worldview. However, where the revisionist movement is crucial is because prior to the revisionist movement in the history of Greek and Western thought, all of them subscribed to the miracle thesis. This miracle thesis tries to suggest that the birth of philosophy was because of the Greek miracle. There was a miracle that happened, trying to as if it's like the Cambrian explosion where the history of biology is concerned. That means to say there was a period that they cannot explain in terms of the sources, but suddenly there was an exponential growth of activity. So for the Greeks, according to them, they were because if you look at it based on the similarities of the theologies in the other parts of the world, why should this Dionysiac kind of excess, why should it lead to philosophy? It may lead, but it did not necessarily do so, because there are other mythologies that did not develop. What is interesting, I think, from that remains to be studied is how the mythologies in the Malay world were used as part of the Islamization process. How it came to be, for example, from the Merah Silau, Merung Mahawangsa, all these early hikayat and all these early historiographical works, how they became transformed. Because the process of the transformation of the hikayat is not a straight cut sort of secularization whereby you have a definitive break. Yes, they first made use of some of the concepts that were current, and gradually develop it until some of those things which were there in the later editions, or rather in the later iterations of the historical works, it became more and more of a scientific as well as universal history. In the beginning, there were motifs such as, yang beranak dalam buluh betung, magical birth, coming down from the kayangan. Gradually, a different kind of magical explanation was offered. Like, for example, the king fell in in his dream, met with the prophet, woke up memorizing the 30 juzu of the Quran. So this replaced the earlier mythology. Gradually, after that, you have still mythologies like this, but in reality, true scholars can explain what they mean. That's why Prof. Al-Attas wrote this historical fact and fiction, to say that because some of the historians amongst the Orientalists and those who were students of the Orientalists, despite despite their best efforts, they will say that some of these things are absurd, that therefore these are mere fictions. But according to Prof. Al-Attas, where history is concerned, especially where Malay historiography is concerned, you need to interpret it in light of the zahir and the batin of the stories. For example, that motif about the Sultan dreaming, meeting the Prophet. First of all, meeting the Prophet in a dream is considered a true dream. But second, and most importantly, what is the significance of a king who established the kingdom upon the meeting of the Prophet and then being taught 30 juzuk and memorizing 30 juzuk within one night? That is the significance of, basically, to suggest that for this nation, the Quran came to become the foundation. Not to say that, in fact, there was a king who dreamt of the Prophet and then knew 30 juzuk of the Quran. But the fact that it's trying to point out is that this kingdom sources as its source of authority ultimately in the Quran and in the Prophet Muhammad as the highest source of authority. No longer the case of being born in a bamboo tree. Anyways, so with regards to the Greek mythologies, we said about how there were similarities with the other ones. So the revisionist school, and in particular Dr. Adi, developing on what Prof. Al-Attas was saying, that perhaps ultimately with regards to the Greeks, they may have come into contact with the teachings of the prophets. Yes, the teachings of the prophets, whereby the prophets already taught clear reasoning. The prophets already taught superior morality, because in our thinking, you need to come into contact with something which is superior to recognize that which has been corrupted. You need to come into contact with something that is good to recognize that which is bad. Because otherwise, despite their disagreement with the Greek mythologies and despite their disagreement with the poets, how can they suddenly come up with an alternative system? How can they come up with this rationally ordered kind of thinking? And in fact, all the civilizations were mutually influencing each other, because there were, at that time, the Greek civilization relied a lot on the Mediterranean world for its culture and civilization. There was constant borrowings of concepts and ideas from Sumeria, from Mesopotamia, from Babylonia. This has happened for a long time. In fact, in the early Greek writings, in the early Greek historiography, there was already mention of China. So that means to say world civilizations were always in contact with each other and in the process of borrowing. Of course, they reserve the right to ask, why is it that philosophy was not born in the other parts of the world? Who knows, that perhaps the teachings of the prophets amongst their followers were retained. And then when the Greek thinkers came into contact with this, we can still at least give them the credit in the sense that they developed this philosophic thinking in a more persistent manner, this spirit of wanting to oppose the rulers in that sense. Nevertheless, within a few generations, as a result of the rise of the philosophers, the poets lost their credibility amongst the people. No longer were the poets thought of as a source and guide for metaphysics and reality. They came to be replaced with the philosophers. And as we said, after the cosmological period exhausted itself, came the rise of the Sophists, because as Greece was expanding, as the rise of city-states such as Athens, what happened was also a flourishing and a flowering of their culture. And with the flourishing and the flowering of their culture, it attracted Sophists. These were people who were teachers who, shall we say, they frequented the households of the nobility. And during that time, the political system that they adopted was of this direct democracy, yes, whereby people with oratorical skills can rise up the ranks. So they used to commission tutors, yes, the Sophists, who taught people basically means and ways through which they can advance their social standing. Amongst those included Protagoras of Abdera, Gorgias, even the names which were mentioned by Plato in his writings. Some of them are the title of his, like Protagoras is one of the titles of his dialogues, Crito, a number of them, and some of them are mentioned in the dialogues as part of the interlocutors, like Thrasymachus. Yes, all these Sophists, basically, what do they share with each other is the skepticism, the agnosticism, basically the belief that you cannot have knowledge. Of course, there's variations. Some of them believe that knowledge cannot transcend opinion. Others thought that knowledge, in reality, with regards to morality, is the interest of the strong against the weak, and so on. Socrates himself was a sophist with regards to metaphysics, yes, but he affirmed and he believed that where morality is concerned, there must be some grain of truth that you can discover. But for metaphysics, he has given up on the idea that you can find this arche, the idea that there is basically a unity or a basis through which you can understand. That is because of the multiplicity of the explanations proposed by the previous scholars. So this was still during the anthropological period. So when Socrates emerged amongst them, he went around asking questions. He introduced a method called for easy understanding, the Socratic method. It's called the Elenches. That means to say it is a mode of questioning that demands of your interlocutor a definition through which you respond by showing a counterexample. And because there is a counterexample, therefore that earlier definition became challenged, so therefore you demand another one. So this is the beginning of what is called dialectics. You say something and I say something that negates it, until gradually you're supposed to arrive at the truth of something. There is also another method, as Plato tried to show in the Socratic method. One is that's the Elenches. The other method is the one that was proposed in the Phaedo. The idea is that, according to his metaphysics, ideas have constellations, and one idea connects with another idea within the constellation. So therefore, when you want to conduct a discussion pertaining to the things that you don't know, you begin with something that you know, and you assume something that you didn't know, so long as it doesn't contradict that which you know. And then you build upon it and see whether it still makes sense. And then continue, and this is what Professor Naqib Al-Attas would utilize in the historical fact and fiction about a lot of things about the history of the Malay world, since the data is not as complete as, for example, the other parts of the Muslim world. So there are certain things that we already know. For example, about Islamic metaphysics, about religion, about language, about, for example, how did he know that in the sejarah Melayu, despite the name Shah Allahu Akbar, a Persian sounding name, how did he know that that Arabic teacher was not Persian, but he was just given a Persian name for literary purpose? In fact, he was from Hadramaut, the teacher, because the example there during the class tu, the teacher was trying to teach the student, dalam sejarah Melayu, how to pronounce certain words in Arabic. The student found it difficulty lah to distinguish between tha and sa and so on. So the student pun out of trying to say that cikgu pun you also suffer from that, the muallim, and then you said how, and so the student said, can you say kucing? Then the teacher said kushin. Yes. Now this kushin is basically something very particular with the Arabs, because the Persians, they can say kucing, the Persians can say pa, they have that. So therefore, despite a Persian sounding name, the reality of the person is that he was Arab, he wasn't Persian. Yes, the Persian sounding name ni came about as a later colouring of the sejarah Melayu, because it was written in a time when the Malay world has come into contact with the literary civilization of the Persians. Jadi they give this person a Persian sounding name, although the basis of writing this story was in fact an experience with a Hadrami teacher. How did Prophet Al-Attas know this? Because he knew the Arabs, he knew how they talk. Itu yang minal ma'lum minal majhul. So the same in the Phaedo. So he said that we can assume certain things once we have supposing you have a strong basis in knowledge, you can assume until you find contradictions. And that can this is what he called rational estimation. And this is how he came up with the historical fact and fiction, whereby he challenged some of the assumptions of the European anthropologists, sociologists, with regards to the dating, yes, with regards to the name. He argues, for example, that Parameswara's name when he became Muslim cannot have been Iskandar, it must have been Muhammad. And what were the name, when was the investiture, and so on and so forth, using this method. Because there are because the ones who wrote history in the past, like Tommy Pires and all these other scholars amongst the Dutch and the Portuguese and the British, they relied on the present historiography, but the framework through which they interpreted the historiographical sources was their own Western background. And this he challenged very definitively in the concluding postscript to the Origin of the Malay Syair. Now back to Socrates' method. So there's at least two Socratic methods that we have identified. One is the what we call the method of the Elanches, yes, questioning, but they are all basically Socrates developed the method of dialectical disputation, shall we say, before it would become systematic later, when Aristotle would develop it into an organon. That means to say a set of tools of logic that became, as an instrument, it became much more refined. But already Socrates had already imposed these forms of dialectical method, and that wreaked havoc on the establishment. Because the establishment at that time, basically, that's why I think Leo Strauss, in trying to characterize the Greek period, or in particular during the Socratic period, he said that this was the confrontation between the philosopher and the city. Yes, this was a confrontation between the philosopher and the city. The city thought politically. And when you say the city thought politically, that means you say the city thought in terms that would strengthen its power. So therefore, any form of resentment is met with harshness. And the chief source that would challenge their status quo at that time was philosophy. Because there was as yet no challenge from religion, because they have managed to banish religion. So philosophy, with its demand for logical consistency, represented a problem for them. And you will see that in the Platonic dialogues. Yes, Plato wrote in 3 periods. In the early periods of his dialogues, most of them focused on the figure of Socrates. Plato had, so basically our chief sources of knowledge when it comes to Socrates is through Plato, because there were other people who wrote lampoons and who wrote satire about Socrates, but these are not really overall useful. So that means to say those who the comic poets who wrote about Socrates, we can see that they have a vested interest against Socrates. But where Plato is concerned, we can see that the figure of Socrates there is very much alive in his dialogues. Plato was born of an aristocratic family. Amongst his family were, people of wealth, such that when he established the academy, yes, it's actually called, it's from the land of Hecademus, a god amongst the Greeks. That estate was owned by his family. He inherited it. So as the first, basically, academician, as the first institute in that sense in the West that was established, basically it came through endowment in that sense. He supported the philosophic, scientific activities in his place. It's very interesting to read philosophy from this perspective. And Windelband affords us this in his writing, because if you were to study philosophy elsewhere, that means to say if you were to buy a book, in introduction to philosophy, they will usually introduce you directly to the ideas. But what is the background? What supports these ideas? I mean, it is as if they were thinking out of thin air, as if suddenly as if philosophers were people who, had a restless night and then they started philosophizing. But it's not that. There's an environment before which philosophy can flourish, especially during the systematic period. Socrates merely went around poking the arguments of the people, but that challenged the status quo. And and Socrates, remember, he was put to death to drink the hemlock on 2 charges, yes, on the corruption of youth and on basically for denouncing the gods, yes, a charge of atheism, shall we say? Blasphemy, yes, blasphemy against the gods. But in reality, what do they mean when blasphemy against the gods do? Against the gods of their desires, ultimately. It's a form of sociolatry again. Every now and then, this worship of society will show. And society is basically a compound of individual desires. A compound of individual desires. That's why I think Al-Farabi in the Ara Ahlul Madinatul Fadilah, he said that democratic societies are liberal societies by definition. Because democratic society live on the principle of the worship of the individual desires as a group. That means to say it's what the people there agree upon to follow as part of their nafs. So if you were to challenge this unspeakable God called society, now it's called society, in the past they were given names lah. But basically it represents the nafs in the general sense. Unfortunately, sometimes Muslims also suffer this, isn't it? When you join an organization, there is something that, this God is sometimes called, this is SOP, you cannot challenge this. Even religion cannot be used to challenge it. It's become like an invisible God lah, in that sense, that people have to worship it. You have to please it. It's not God in the rububiyah sense of the word. It is in the uluhiyah. That means to say the divinity the deity that you worship. That means to say whose will has to be supreme. And if you have to reinterpret the Quran, you reinterpret the Quran in order to fulfill the desires of this mob. So these people, when they were being challenged by Socrates, you can imagine it is akin to, but not necessarily the same, because of course they cannot be the same with the prophets. But akin to how the people of Ibrahim, when he told them, the one that destroyed these other gods was the biggest amongst them. If you read in Surah Al-Anbiya, they didn't immediately punish him. First they turned and they looked downwards. That means to say they bowed in shame, because they knew they were doing something ridiculous. They said that and then they respond to him, you know that they cannot talk. He said it is the representative of the people that said to Ibrahim, not Ibrahim that said to him. But yet, because of that, because of the worship of the nafs, as a result, in order to diffuse the situation, rather than to accept that they were mistaken, they decided to burn him. Like Socrates, when he showed to the people that basically what they considered to be pious, what they considered to be good, what they considered to be just are sometimes the very opposite of justice. Especially when he says that, when he goes against the statement that justice means following the strong, following the mighty. Justice is a matter of convention. When he challenges these fundamental assumptions, gradually, some people are not going to be happy, isn't it? Especially the tyrannical amongst them. So as a result, they decided as a mob to, instead of submitting to truth, you have the first martyr to philosophy. Of course, the first martyr to philosophy is not the same as the shaheed, isn't it? There's nobody to claim him at the other door lah, maksudnya. There's no one waiting for him at the arrival. Thank you for dying for philosophy, but there's no itu. But nevertheless, there must have been courage in Plato. If you read it, the very vivid account in the Phaedo, he was speaking about the irrationality of fear against death. But he had no sound knowledge as to what was going to happen. He said, either I will die, that means to say, and be destroyed, for which there's no reason to fear because there will be no experience of pain after this, or it might be that I'll be resurrected. But if I'm resurrected, then I'll be able to meet with the cool guys in the history. I will be able to hang with the great poets and the great personalities that I respect. So therefore he was calm, at least according to Plato's description lah. We don't know in reality, isn't it? But nevertheless, suppose we take Plato on his word, perhaps because of this thinking, maybe he was calm, because he also had a good reason to believe that the soul will survive death, because he thinks that of all the things in the world, for every other thing there is a corrupting principle. Yes, metal, wood, there is something that leads to its destruction. But then for the soul, he said, it continues to grow, especially with knowledge and so on. So therefore he believes that the spiritual aspect of man must be able to survive death, although he cannot know for sure. That's in the Phaedo. Plato also wrote an apology for Socrates. Yes, that's brilliant. The apology doesn't mean here minta maaf. An apology here means a defense of Socrates, to defend the philosophic way of life. When Socrates died, this deeply impacted Plato. He didn't immediately started teaching and writing. He went away. He traveled to Egypt, studied under the Pythagoreans. He traveled to various parts that was known in the Greek consciousness and Greek civilization, including southern Italy. He even tried in certain cases, in certain parts of his life, to establish to put his vision into action, in the sense of trying to establish a philosopher king. But then he saw that, for example, in one of the Italian cities, there was a young prince. He became a tutor to that young man. Tengok macam tak boleh pergi berani. The boy is only interested in their desires, and the city as a whole is only interested in banquet. They have 2 banquets in a day. It's just about fulfilling their desires. So he cannot implement the ideas. Nevertheless, in the end, what is interesting is that at the ripe age of 40, that's when he decided that ultimately he needs to focus his labor on teaching. And that's why then he established upon the land that he inherited, the Academus, the Academia. And there began what is understood as the scientific tradition. Because there you would have a group of scholars. And this group of scholars would have collaborative learning, collaborative research. They would have lectures in which he would give a discussion. He was, and then he established the necessity of method, in the sense that everyone in the academy have to study mathematics, geometry, logic. So this became the foundation of thought. And remember, Aristotle himself spent about 20 years in that place. That's 20 years. And you will see the notion of a scientific tradition. So before you want to say that somebody is a philosophic genius, you must understand that all geniuses in the history of philosophy were brilliant by virtue of the fact that they came into contact with the tradition. Nobody is a genius without the tradition, because they have seen what was proposed before and what was the weakness of the argument, and then they continued and so on. So if you read the history of, if you read Aristotle's metaphysics, yes, before he came up with his formulation of the notion of reality and truth, he has already done a very good, in present day terms, literature review lah, we say, from the beginnings of thought as far as it was recorded until his time. And in fact, a lot of our sources about what these people were thinking, Thales, Anaximenes, Anaximander, including Parmenides and Heraclitus, came from Aristotle's metaphysics, as well as where Parmenides is concerned, the dialogue of Plato. Yes, so that means to say they were people who were scholars. Plato wrote dialogues, but Aristotle, what survived of his writings were basically the lecture notes. And you can see how systematic it is. Yes, one problem was discussed, another one, everything is arranged in systematic manner and fashion. So this was during the systematic period. And there's a lot of things that we can learn as Muslims as to the importance of the scientific tradition, the importance of the class of scholars, the importance of a scientific conceptual scheme. These are all necessary before you can have scientific activities. The importance of collaborative learning, the importance of problem-based learning. All these things that you need a community of scholars before a movement can be born. You can read on your own, but it's not going to be the same as when you divide according to you. And great movements in history, despite being led by thinkers, must have behind them a strong tradition. Either the tradition is alive and living in the case of scholars who met each other, or it is in the case of a scholar who benefited from the writings of the previous scholars. For example, in the West, you have, not only did you have this, yes, Plato and Aristotle, of course, these were the most brilliant stars, but behind them was this movement like that. Just like Imam Shafi'i in our tradition, isn't it? Before Imam Shafi'i can become Imam Shafi'i, he must have studied with the Hanafites, with the Malikites, and disputed and discussed in order to develop. According to, I think, Aquinas, yes, he said that the teeth of understanding, shall we say, is sharpened by disputation. The teeth of understanding is sharpened by disputation. That means to say discussion of ideas. Aquinas likewise. How did Aquinas become Aquinas? Because he already had the benefit of a scientific tradition and and access to a community of scholars, which he can debate, which he can disagree with, which he can benefit from. Yes, he's coming into contact with Albertus Magnus, Imam al-Ghazali, with Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni. They were brilliant, they were geniuses, but the geniuses can become possible within a limit, and that limit is the scientific tradition. Otherwise, you can be without knowledge and cognizance of the scientific tradition. Even if you were to become a genius, for example, I've seen people who, supposing they are precocious in their youth, but without proper knowledge of the tradition, they end up, not doing much. That's because in the beginning you will do everything that people around you say is the most difficult. Then you start doing it, yes, you understand mathematics and so on, but it will plateau after a certain period, and beyond which you cannot develop. But those who survive within the tradition, they can develop, they can expand, they can propose new solutions. And many people in the scientific tradition were not like Aquinas before Aquinas can become possible, because the trivium and the quadrivium that was developed, the book of sentences, the questions and disputations, all these things, the commentaries that were written before him, was the one that allowed him to finally propose a novel Thomistic synthesis. Like Aristotle, before he can propose his own theory of being, he had the benefit of what was before him. Of course, his genius mind was the ability to see the proper development of Greek thought. We want to have until 11, yeah. Okay. Did we start at 9? A bit more. 9:30? 9:15. Okay. Now it's almost an hour. Do we have questions so far? Any discussions?
You might want to introduce also say Al-Andalusi sa Tabaqat Al-Umam, where he mentions how the Greeks who actually came into contact with the Egyptians, and the Egyptians actually learned from a certain Hermes, whom Said Al-Andalusi identified as Nabi Idris.
I see. So that is the origins of the what Nasar was saying and so on, isn't it?
Yeah. So perhaps that could actually be the very introduction of the scientific community and scientific sphere.
That's possible also. That's very instructive, because I think even in there were a series of books that were written in the early Islamic tradition, on the defense of nubuwah. There's a genre for it. What is it called? The defense of prophecy. That means to say the defense of the prophecy of Prophet Muhammad. What is it called? A'lam an-nubuwah. Yes, the A'lam an-nubuwah. I think sorry, Imam Al-Bayhaqi wrote a book. So did amongst the Mu'tazilis, Abu Hatim, I think Al-Razi wrote one. Another one was written by Qadi Abdul Jabbar. Yes, is there another one? Abu Ali Al-Jubba'i. Yes. So in Abu Hatim Al-Razi's account, he there also spoke about this. So that means there is almost a consensus amongst Muslim scholars that they knew that the origins of the sciences lie in prophets. It's very interesting how our scholars came to that realization that it is not just from the human mind that you can conceive of these ideas. Yes. So in the Tabaqat Al-Umam, and then in these works, in the genre of works on the A'lam an-Nubuwah, yes, the science of prophecy, you will see that of metaphysical knowledge, it is commonly attributed to the prophets. Perhaps not all Sunnis will say, I mean, depending on the source of the Sa'id Al-Andalusi, the Sunni tradition, usually they do not name prophets unless it is certain, because one of the statements in the Aqaid al-Nasafi, it said there, we do not say of a person that he is a prophet unless it is known that he is a prophet, nor do we subtract a person from the register of prophecy if he is known to be a prophet. So out of safety, I suppose, the Maturidiyah amongst in particular the school of al-Nasafi, in order to prevent aberrations in the future, which we have now seen, like they say that the Buddha is Dhul-Kifli, and so on and so forth. Ibrahim is Abrahman, and so on and so forth. And then Prof. Wan gave an explanation about this. Why is it necessary to maintain, based on the rule again of that min al-ma'lum min al-majhul. The identification of the Prophet is the calling of people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the rejection of shirk. So therefore, if a certain historical person is not known to have done that, we don't have to take the trouble to say that he in fact said that, unless it appears that they said it somewhere. But we can accept that they were perhaps given a certain illumination with certain aspects of the world. Like the Buddha, for example, there were certain aspects of moral truths that he discovered, which is agreeable to us, at least in the ethical sphere. But we don't have to agree with him in the theological sphere. We don't have to say that, we don't have to confuse ourselves and say that he's a prophet, because he didn't, as far as the Buddhist teachings in the canons that has come down to us, there was no mention of the existence of a one true God. So like that. But where the Greeks are concerned, even there's a lot of grounds, yes, aside from this Umam, the Tabaqat al-Umam, the internal sources of Greek ideas, for example, Plato and all these other people, their lives have shown that they all benefited immensely from what they call the mystery religions. But what is these mystery religions? And if they are concentrated in Egypt, of course, the problem will be then when they encountered these prophets and they have this, they come into contact with these ideas. When Plato proposed his metaphysics, how similar it is with some of our scholars. Some people say, did Plato also, therefore, was he guided in that sense? Now, this is a very tricky matter. It's a very delicate matter. Because, okay, now to introduce a bit on Plato's metaphysics. In the Republic, Plato propounded a metaphysics in order to solve the problem of justice. Remember what we said about Socrates in the past. Justice was a major concern. But Socrates did not resort to establishing a metaphysics in order to ground his ethics. He merely said that certain moral truths are known intuitively, like the fact that it is better to suffer injustice than to commit injustice, that the committing of injustices leads to a disharmony in the body or in the soul, that the tyrannical soul is unhappy, so on and so forth. These are for him sufficient as arguments. But for Plato, he wants to say that somehow being ethical, being just, is also metaphysically justifiable. That there is in fact an epistemology, there is in fact a road to truth or road to knowledge. So he is, in a sense, the first systematic thinker for connecting between, these are very essential, I think, when it comes to philosophy, the three major branches of philosophy. Metaphysics, and truth, and then there's epistemology. This pertains to knowledge. And then there is axiology. Yes, pertaining to values. So, Plato thought that these three were interconnected. That what you hold to be theory or to be reality and truth must be based on an epistemology. That means to say you must have secure foundations to be able to say what you affirm to be true and real. And your conception of what is true and real, including about the road to get there, is the ground of your values. So for Plato, his metaphysics is the metaphysics of what we call the theory of forms. Okay, to this I will have some recourse to explain the metaphysics of Plato. So accordingly, the foundation before we arrive at a world of forms, which is extramental, aspatial, atemporal realm, yes, which is the ground of this realm. According to him, there is in existence, independently of this world, an unchanging world of permanent archetypes. Archetypes ni is like a cookie mold, if you imagine, like you want to make pineapple tarts, there's a cookie mold, isn't it? And then there is individual tarts, which all conform to the shape and structure of the cookie mold. Or in other words, for example, you have the idea of a chair, which is universal. And then there are individual chairs. But that which is individual chair, since it has a material substrate, is bound to corruption, is bound to multiplicity, and it lacks perfection. There's no chair that has, in terms of in terms of its legs, equality to the extent that there will be 1 or 2 millimeters in which they are not equal in that sense. Chairs are bound to corruption. And then when it comes to an individual chair, there is always some material attributes, such as color, such as material through which it is made. But yet all conform to the idea of a chair. So therefore, according to Plato, there must be some universal idea through which these individuals partake of. So he starts with the problem of language. He arrives at a metaphysical theory. So according to him, relations such as equality, attributes such as beauty, all these things, they exist in a permanent realm. And the realm in this world, or this world which is full of changing things, is a source of opinion. But your intellect connects to the realm of forms. The realm of forms which is unchanging, permanent. The realm of this world is the source of corruption and change. So that metaphysical realm is a source of epistemology. It is metaphysics. It is a source of ontology. That means to say it is the source of the existence of this realm. Because of the existence of that realm, this realm is like a mirror that shows myriad of forms in temporary measures, but then it disappears. But our mind, through a process in terms of epistemology, he advances a theory of what you call recollection. That means to say our soul and spirit is of the nature of the realm of forms. But yet, when we descend into this world, we are made to forget about the existence of the forms. But coming into contact with the individual material substances allows our mind to recollect the ideas, the forms, the archetypes. So, using metaphysics and epistemology, he tries to ground his values. According to him, just as of the many forms that exist in the realm of forms, there will also be a form of the perfect society and a form of the perfect man, through which other men or other human beings partake of the universal species man, and other societies partake of the universal species of perfect society. So, why he wrote the Republic, in a sense, was to describe the form of the perfect society as a utopia, through which other city-states in this world are to be used, are to be judged according to the criteria that he set forth. So this is what you call idealism. Yeah? Idealism, as opposed to the realist philosophies. The idea is that since you can conceive of something which is more perfect than that which is true, or than that which is existing, so therefore it needs to be used to ground that which is existing. But of course, where idealism is concerned, it's problematic, because you would conceive of, for example, your spouse in her ideal form. Perhaps she would not grow old, he would not grow old. Yes, in your own ideal picture of yourself, you would remain at your peak forever, or you would arrive at your peak and remain at your peak forever. But that's not real. Yes, that's why it's famous in movie dialogues. When the woman will say to the man, "You're not really in love with me. You're in love with the idea of me." Yes, through which she is an imperfect copy. So that means to say there is some underlying Platonic conception there. Or when they say great minds discuss ideas, medium minds discuss events, and mediocre minds discuss people. This is also Platonic in nature. Yes, because ideas are permanent and unchanging. Events are at least superior to petty individuals, because events describe something which is truer in terms of reality. And then there's individuals, which are the least in terms of in the metaphysical spectrum, Because in the Islamic intellectual tradition, we didn't make this distinction. We said that, we discuss the best man, we discuss the best idea, we discuss the best event. That means to say, in terms of where ideas are concerned, of course with the reference, with the reality behind it, our contemplation is always on the one God who is universal and unchanging, yani bi-dhikr. But we also discuss important events in history, such as the Battle of Badr and what it represented. We also discuss individuals, such as the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Great minds in the intellectual tradition of Islam cannot escape from discussing the historical person of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Great minds cannot escape from referring to events, referring to personalities. Imam Al-Ghazali, yes, he was a genius, but yet, in the Ihya, there is a book referring to the akhlaq of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Even in the Kitab Dhikrul Maut, he made copious references to existing human beings. Is he mediocre, in writing that? So therefore, it's just sometimes, in our time, because philosophy is understood to be quotes. You take this quote and then you put it, this is my philosophy of the day. Then you say another day you put Oprah statement and it's my philosophy. And just because it is said by someone, and you have that colon down there, and then you have a very nice picture, therefore you must think that it is profound, isn't it? Anyways, so Plato designed so basically he drew a word picture about what the perfect city would be like. In reality, did Plato claim that he was reading of the realm of forms? I mean, if you think about it, if you look at the actual design of the perfect city as he conceived it, it is a merely an idealized version of what he considers just, and therefore it can be challengeable, isn't it? Because if you say, unlike the universal idea of a chair, which is singular and unchanging because it represents the human-seated form, an object designed for the human-seated form, the idea of a perfect society in reality is dependent on the evaluator. Because some would consider inequality, inequality cannot be in the perfect society. Others consider that inequality is a major ingredient of the perfect city. Why? Because without inequality, there will not be struggles. Without struggles, there will not be great poets and great artists. Somehow, in the history of the West, even to a certain extent in our recent history also, people who had tragic childhood and poverty would somehow make great works. Of course, it is wrong to design a society in which you design for poverty so that you can have great art in the equation. But we will know that somehow it is inevitable. Yes, you don't plan for that. But that means to say, where political philosophy is concerned, the total elimination of inequality is not necessarily the most important goal in society. Yes, because I think even in Islamic political philosophy, if you look at Mawardi, or if you look at amongst the Sunnis, the genre of the Mirror of Princes, or even Al-Farabi, for example, they did not make the elimination of poverty, the most important goal of a city. But rather, the most important goal of the city would be what is binding them in terms of the philosophy, in terms of their worldview, in terms of their way of life. That is the most important thing that is prioritized. But of course, they all agree that you should not have too much distance between the richest and the poor. And in practice, in the Sharia, there are means through which the gap is bridged through various wajibat. Similarly, with regards to the best city, there is it is practical in nature. It's part of practical philosophy. It requires practical wisdom. But for Plato, he wants to say that whatever is his intuition is in fact what is read from the realm of forms. That's how it became disintegrated. So there is the attack based on the moral evaluation. That is attacking the axiology. We want to say that in terms of the realm of forms, there is no perfect society. Or if you have a perfect society, that perfection is basically you trying to include your own preferences into the perfect form of the society. But Aristotle thought that he had an epistemological as well as a metaphysical argument against Plato's theory of forms. He introduced certain dilemma with the theory of forms. For example, he asked about how does the individual realities partake of the forms, especially because he didn't have a conception of creation yet. There was no creation ex nihilo. There was they all agreed in the permanence of being. So therefore, how can there be what is the relation between the individual material and the forms? One. So this was a question that cannot be answered amongst the Platonists. That means to say the inheritors of Plato. Second, he said, well, is there a form of the color blue? Suppose you say yes, there's a form of the color blue. And then is there a form of a particular shade of blue? And supposing you have a spectrometer whereby you can distinguish between 100 colors of blue. Do these individual instantiations, do they also have permanent forms? So therefore, according to Aristotle, this would lead to a duplication of everything that exists in this world. So in a crude manner, Aristotle is using Occam's razor type of argument, whereby he said that it removes the necessity of actually propounding the existence of the realm of forms. So gradually what happened was from Plato to Aristotle, Aristotle conceived of a different and alternate conception of reality in which no longer you have to assume the existence of the realm of forms. Furthermore, even in terms of the epistemology, it is not really sound, because according to Plato, you arrive at the metaphysics, sure, through recollection, but that recollection is facilitated through the process of dialectics. But even the dialectical method cannot give you values. So therefore, it is a skewed type of philosophy, because despite, supposing we say maybe in terms of the construction of the system, he had the assistance of the Greeks and the teachings of the prophets. But where method is concerned, since he's chiefly reliant on theory and method of rationalism, so you cannot therefore arrive at a genuine theory of the realm of forms without somebody disputing it. It is not done through ma'rifah. He did not have ma'rifah, Plato. Yes, because he himself in the end, as Bertrand Russell would say in the History of Western Philosophy, it represents the greatest instance of self-criticism. Plato himself would repudiate his belief in the realm of forms in his later works, such as the Parmenides, yes, the dialogue on Parmenides. By then, he himself used arguments to show that what he taught in the Republic was untenable. So from Plato, we move to Aristotle. So far, so good? Any questions? Yes. Yeah, I mean, where Islamic epistemology is concerned, we don't totally disagree with him, but our source for claiming such a statement is revelation about Adam being taught the names. Yes, when he was being taught Al-Imla Adam al-Asma'a kullaha, that means to say we can build our own epistemology based on the Quran. Ultimately, for example, we agree with rationalism as a method. We agree with empiricism without there being a gulf between the two. We also agree in the idea of recollection, a limited idea of recollection, because that is also derivable from our revelation. But our source is revelation, and the confirmation or the certainty that is arrived at by revelation is not through rational means alone, but also through ibadah, through ma'rifah, through that knowledge which is granted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there's similarities, but then the ground is different. Our ground is the belief in tawatur. That means to say the report of a group of people in which the mind cannot conceive that they would purpose together upon a lie. And this tawatur basically is the foundation of how we know that the Quran that we have today is the one that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. But as for the Quran that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how do we know that it is in fact that he was in fact speaking the truth, or rather that it was in fact the word of God? We know that, of course, despite it being khabar ahad, that means to say narrated by one person, the threshold of epistemology that is met there is because of the possession of ijaz, yes, mu'jizah, that is literally translated as the incapacitation. That means to say it incapacitates whoever that denies that it is in fact the word of God. So the ijaz of the Quran is its own genre, amongst which is the for example, you can discuss from the perspective of internal consistency. You can discuss from the perspective of the superiority of the words, the authorial voice of God, and so on and so forth. But this is still now in the realm of the cogitation. But in reality, there is also from the Sufis' perspective that there is in the Quran something of the nature of barakah that awakens within your soul the firm belief in these things. So there is rational consistency that belongs to a system that made you understand that it is impossible to be the created word of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But there is also something which is spiritual in nature, because your soul, your heart is given access to it. So despite despite similar proposals, where Plato was concerned, his foundation, ultimately, despite his source, the ideas came from reports, but he defends the ideas based on rational proposition, not on report. So he felt free to develop the ideas that he received on the account of the report and to mix it with other sources. So it's a problem of reporting ultimately, because for Plato, despite, okay, so for example, supposing we say that there are some elements of similarity, but with regards to what happens after this world, now Plato felt that it's okay to take from the poets of the Greeks. Yes. His eschatology, meripik meraban lah basically, because he did not receive, maksudnya the report that he received from what was the neighboring places did not come to explain what was going to happen in the afterlife. So he used the method of rational imagination, where there is no access granted there. But in the Quran, the epistemology is very clear. When it comes to the ghaibiyat, meaning to say the ilahiyat, as well as what you call the ma wara at-tabi'ah, it is not a science. That means to say, insofar as method theory is concerned, it is wahbi in nature. It is not iktisabi. It is hikmah. It is given and granted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore, the details of what will happen after this life, these are all revealed. That's why Allah said in the Quran, وَمَا كُنْتَ تَدْرِي, you did not know about these things. And certain things you will come to know later, individually, as a result of experience. So that's our epistemology, in that sense. Is it alright? Okay. Wow, I thought I want to cover Greek thought in one meeting, but we're still at Plato. course, it's to pay an homage to Plato. That's why Alfred Whitehead, he used to say that Western civilization is a series of footnotes to Plato. If you get your Plato right, accordingly, the rest of Western civilization will be easily understood. According to Schopenhauer, according to his own admission, he said that he took 7 years to study philosophy. He only focused on two thinkers, Plato and Immanuel Kant. And according to him, based on Plato and Immanuel Kant, he managed to write his great works. Of course, this we cannot believe this to be true in reality, because in the construction of his system, we know that he read also the Eastern philosophies. He read the Muslims, but he doesn't want to say that he read the Eastern philosophies and the Muslims, so he said, I only read Plato. But there were marked resemblances in his system, despite him being a pessimist, an idealist, and many things which are in disagreement with the worldview of Islam. We know that in point of construction, the ideas that he derived from includes the ideas of the Buddhists and the Muslims. Anyways, but it does not take away from the greatness of Plato in that sense, the thoroughness, the beauty of expression, even, for example, the terminologies that he used to distinguish between, in terms of his psychology, is very rich in that sense. And the works and the dialogues of Plato can be read for pleasure, not just for philosophy, shall we say. It's a very effective propedeutic, or rather didactic tool. That means to say it's as well as propedeutic. That means to say it prepares you for philosophy. Other scholars say that the proper propedeutic arts are logic and the trivium and the quadrivium, because according to them, so I want to explain basically, when you want to study philosophy, there's two methods through which you arrive at philosophy. One is to study the propedeutic arts. That means to say the trivium and the quadrivium. Yes. Kalau dalam bahasa Arabnya, you say nahwu, saraf, balaghah. Yeah, that means to say the linguistic sciences, grammar, rhetoric, logic. And then the four, the quadrivium, yes, astronomy, music, mathematics, and what's the one? Geometry and arithmetic, isn't it? They're distinguished. Why do the madrasas and the scholastic system, why do they focus on this trivium and the quadrivium? Because it teaches you rules of harmony. Yes, why they studied music? Because they understood harmony, so that way they can, after that, they can go into systems. So this was the method that was preferred by most of the madrasas and influenced by Aristotle to a certain extent. So Aristotle, they made this into a system whereby you follow this, and then as a result, if you have the talent for it, you can continue to pursue the more abstract discussions. These are all as preparation. But the alternative route through which you can study philosophy, depending on your personality, is to read the dialogues of Plato for preparation. Because the dialogue form is more natural in the day-to-day thing. It allows you to arrive at abstract discussions from disputations, and disputations is natural to the human language. Then gradually, yes, from finishing the dialogues, you arrive at it builds in your mind the capacity to appreciate more and more abstract level of discussion. So Plato's dialogues are arranged like that. The early periods, for example, if you read the Protagoras against the Sophists and all these things, it prepares you for logical disputations. And then eventually you get introduced into his. So I think personally, for me, I prefer the Platonic route compared to the Aristotelian route. But the Aristotelian route is superior insofar as it begins with logic, as it begins with systematic thinking. But a master Platonist and a master Aristotelian can both appreciate each other's system in that sense. So they say, in point of history, you are either a Platonist or an Aristotelian. It's as a matter of personal preference in that sense. That's 15 minutes. Do we want to go into Aristotle? Let's try. Let's see how much we can. I mean, it would be doing injustice to him. But, well, we already mentioned that he studied at the academy for 20 years. Aristotle was the son of a physician. And being the son of a physician, that means to say he was brought up within a culture of knowledge. Early on in his life, he's already developed a keen interest in biological life forms. Particularly, it was said that he was a marine biologist. Not in the sense that we understand today, but at the very least, he was very interested in classification, observation of similarities and differences. Aristotle was the one who developed philosophy into a system. Plato was a brilliant mathematician, rhetorician, and logician, and philosopher, but he wrote in the dialogue form, and the dialogue form has certain restrictions. But even Plato, you will come to see how the dialogue form gradually gave way into a lecture style, because in the end of his works, it's no longer a dialogue that involves two equally competent people. It involves a figure of authority that gives a long lecture, and the other one says, yes, I concur. Another one statement, and it said, yes, I concur. That's all there is in the later ones. Because that means to say, this is where by now Plato is expounding a theory. No longer is he debating the way Socrates was. When Aristotle wrote, remember we said about, yes, him being a marine biologist. Later on, he would become the tutor of Alexander the Great. He established his own lyceum, yes, after leaving parting ways with the Platonists. As a part of his system, to look at it directly, where his theory of reality and truth is concerned, he considered that there was no realm of forms. So he substituted Plato's theory of forms with what is called hylomorphism. There's 4 causes according to him. Material, formal, efficient, and then you have the final form or teleological form, telos. So according to him, the forms or the universals are inherent in the things themselves, not in the realm of forms. Your mind abstracts it through experience with the actual things. Okay? So, let's go through 2 examples. One, a naturally occurring thing. Let's, to begin with, that can have all these 4, yes? Let's say a tree. Oh, yes. From which you derive wood. That is the material cause. And then you have the shape of a chair. The efficient cause, the one that made the wood, the one that extracted the wood from the tree, is the carpenter. And the telos, it's an object designed for the human-seated cause or form. In nature, you have this also, isn't it? From the sanubari, the acorn. Then you have the tree. You have the material cause. You have the formal cause. That means to say the form of the tree as it would be perfected. As for the efficient cause, it is internal to the acorn. Yes, there is an active grain within the acorn that causes it to metamorphose. Yes? Meta means after, morphosis. That's the process. To change form from this point to that point. So, it is a metaphysics of what we call potentiality and actuality. So, in the tree, the chair exists in potentia. In the acorn, the oak tree exists in potentia. So, that process of metamorphosis is the process of extracting the potential to becoming that which is actual. So, in this case, the efficient cause is metamorphosis. That means to say the inward movement. And the telos is to become a tree. Yes? Sheikh Nuruddin Ar-Rani, he gives reference to this, I think, in the Hujjatul Siddiq. He said there that the reality of a thing. So he gives two examples. Yes? Hakikat perahu adalah tukangnya. Yes? The reality of the ship is the boat maker. Prime matter, which is this universe, being as a whole, that has been existing forever, one thing coming out of the other. But anything which exists in concreta, that means in concrete, that which exists in concrete is always a form and a matter together. Okay. What is interesting about this metaphysics of Aristotle is that from the efficient and the teleological, since there is a word telos there, that means to say the final form, that means to say the intention of something, he can derive his axiology, the theory of happiness, what we call the eudaimonic ethics, or yes, eudaimonia, sometimes is translated as human flourishing, because it comes from two words, yes. Demon means spirit. You means good spirit. That means to say the condition in which your inward self is in a state of flourishing. So, are we more like the tree or are we more like the chair? According to Aristotle, we're a bit more like the tree than the chair. Except that unlike the acorn, which will always become a tree, in human beings, there is the factor of socialization. There is a factor of society. That means to say, yes, in point of bios, that means to say in point of physical life, you will become, that aspect of you is like the tree. You will grow from childhood to adulthood. But from the point of view of life, that means to say of the spirit, now that's where the purpose is happiness. The purpose of the body, its entelechy is to become an adult. But the purpose of the spirit is to arrive at happiness. You will fulfill your physical potentiality, but your spiritual or your mental potentiality will depend on the society that you are raised in, on the habits that you adopt, on the level of education will reflect just what aspect of the grain of potential that will be actualized. According to Aristotle, society is the one, or society including habits which you adopt, is the one that will, shall we say, fashion your inward potential. When that society, for example, reflects the reality of man as an entelechy, as an actualized man. An actualized man is a man who's harmonious, who has done thinking and reflecting, and has done things which is considered noble. For Aristotle, he considers nobility to consist of two things. either a life of warfare for the sake of truth, or the life of politics also for the sake of justice. But compared to these two, that which is superior is the life of reason. Yes. This is coupled with his trifold psychology, because he believed in what we call souls today, but what he means by soul is like energy. So a human being is composed of the plant spirit, or the vegetative spirit, the animal spirit, and the human spirit. The vegetative spirit is that aspect of man which is responsible for the principle of growth. Yes, like vegetables. And the animal is that which is responsible for the principle of movement. And then there is the intellectual spirit, or the intellectual soul. That one is responsible for the principle of thinking. So, according to Aristotle, of these three, that which is the specific differentia, the specific difference in terms of man as a species, is that act of thinking. The specific difference of man is his reasoning capacity. When we talk about specific difference, that means to say man comes from the general class of animals. Yes, he's of the class of animals. Animals here doesn't mean beast. Animal here means living thing. Yeah? Because he is of the class of living beings that is also moving. Yes, the anima in that case. But he also contains within himself a principle which is his specific difference that distinguishes mankind from the others. According to our scholars amongst the mutakallimin, like Taftazani, for example, he explains that man, in order to arrive at the specific difference, it is not merely sufficient to look at what man does differently. For example, we don't say that man is the swimming animal, the laughing animal, the animal that discovered fire, and other things. But we look at what is most suitable to this. In this case, it is reasoning. So it is the reasoning animal. In Arabic, they use the word hayawanun natiq. Yes, the eloquent being, the being that is capable of rational thinking also. So look at that oak tree from the acorn. The acorn will always become oak trees. But the human being, depending on the process of socialization, you will become different things. According to him, not all societies are suitable for human flourishing. And that is because he has a good ground of knowledge with regards to alternative societies during that time. He sent some of his students to study the existing as well as the historical constitutions that exist and the conditions of the people, insofar as they can do it. That's how he can classify different types of society in his politics. There are kingships, which is governed by a single monarch. There are what we will call aristocracies, which is governed by a group of select individuals. And there are what we call democracies, yes, group governed by many people. That's the corrupt form. The degenerate form of a kingship is a tyranny. The degenerate form of an aristocracy, where a number of people rule the majority, will be called an oligarchy. That means to say that a group of business people who use their privileged position to make money at the expense of the majority. As for the corrupt forms of democracy, it is what you call the rule of the mob. That means to say where the generality of people consistently look at the government to satisfy whatever desires that they have. So according to Aristotle, depending on the different kinds of society, it will reflect in either symptoms of psychic well-being or symptoms of psychic neurosis. So that's how he derives his theory of happiness. So according to him, again, where both of them, yes, secretly are in love with good morals. Yes, they love morality so much that they want to defend it. But both of them, so therefore they try to stretch their philosophic imagination to give a ground to morality. For Plato, we said that he used the theory of forms in order to smuggle in his defense of morality. So basically these two were disciples of Socrates who tried to defend their teacher. One using a metaphysics of forms, Aristotle thought that, I can do it using hylomorphism. So there he said that, according to Aristotle, he identified eudaimonia with morality. So he pegged it like that. So according to him, living the moral life leads to symptoms of psychic well-being. So there he said, to be happy is to be good. Then he adds, the teleological ethics, like when it comes to goodness of a knife, it means utility. But goodness of a man depends on the specific difference of man again. So the goodness of a man is the ability to use his rational powers, yes, the powers of reasoning granted to him, which is his specific difference. So the best life, according to Aristotle, is the life of reason, the life of philosophical contemplation that leads to truth. According to him, this is the greatest use of your existence, to be contemplating that which is permanent and unchanging. Yes. According to Windelband, in reality, Plato and Aristotle, despite being geniuses, despite being brilliant systematizers, they were running against the contrary spirit. They were contrary to the spirit of the time, which was already being too much attacked by the Sophists. In reality, Plato and Aristotle still fail in the large scale. Yes, despite the continuance of the Lyceum and the Academy, yes, beyond their initial founders, as the generality of the tone and the spirit was already tending towards sophistry. Despite the brilliance of arguments of Plato and Aristotle, despite the brilliance of Aristotle in this, his prescriptions for people to become moral were not followed. And one of the facts of his failure is that the one that he tutored, yes, Alexander, who would become Alexander the Great, still submitted to the excess of megalomania. Yes, megalomania. Yes, the desire to be great, ambitiousness. That means to say, that even in his own student, he didn't manage to inculcate the value of prudence, the value of what is it called? Iffah. Yes. How can he teach his student iffah? Yes. How can he teach his students zuhud? All these things. Yes. That which he discovered that when it comes to character in the Nicomachean ethics, he said that a lot of the principles of justice is reliant and dependent upon the doctrine of the mean between two excesses. Yes, you're not supposed to be deficient, nor are you supposed to be excessive. For example, courage is the mean between foolhardiness and cowardice. Similarly, generosity lies between the mean of being a spendthrift and the other excess. So on and so forth. Yes, good conversation or wittiness lies between boorishness and buffoonery, and so on and so forth. But despite arriving at this philosophically, that you have to maintain the doctrine of the mean, what is the imperative? What is the source of imperative that will allow people that will force people to follow it? Because some people will not buy into this idea that it will lead to symptoms of psychic well-being. What he says as psychic well-being sometimes is pursued with pain. Yes, because for him, he distinguishes between the kind of good that is pursued for its own sake, and there are goods which is pursued for the other sake. For example, there are goods which are good in themselves, like happiness. There are, on the other hand, goods which is pursued for the sake of other things, like going to the dentist, exercise. These things are not pleasurable in themselves, but they give you the results that you desire. But even then, will people all follow that which is ultimately good for them, or will they then follow that which they desire? So basically, he could not come up with a system that would make people overcome that which they love the most, and that is their nafs. It's something that his system couldn't have done. Yes, some people attack Aristotle for for philosophical reasons, but ultimately, for us as Muslims, we understood that this thing sometimes is not a matter of philosophy. It's a matter of religion. Yes. After the Aristotelian period, they descended into skepticism, and because the Roman Empire, after they attacked the Greeks, there was a long period of decadence and a long period of following people's desires, such that in time, gradually, philosophy, with its brilliance in terms of systems, became relegated to a place of no importance. In its state was the Hellenistic philosophies that prioritize an ethics, yes, be it in the form of Epicureanism or in the form of Stoicism. That means to say, all philosophy at that time, in the first, second, and third century, before Christianity became the ruling principle in the West, was focused on how to achieve happiness, but only in the individual sense, not in the overall societal sense. In positive science, they continued to develop. Using the organon, they managed to develop astronomy, develop medicine, and a number of the other sciences. But where philosophy, in this sense, metaphysics and epistemology and axiology, it no longer caught the imagination of the many. So therefore, the scientific brilliance of the Greeks lost in terms of the spirit. Nobody wanted to come up with or rather the systems failed to capture people's imaginations. Alright, I think that should be a good conclusion to the chapter on the Greeks. Inshallah, the next time when we discuss the Islamic philosophy, I'll say I'll say a few more things about the Hellenistic period immediately before the advent of Islam, and then we will focus on the Neoplatonic Aristotelians, in particular Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, a bit on Al-Ghazali, but the Ghazali of the Tahafut. And then maybe if we have time, inshallah, the system of Ibn Rushd. Of course, where Al-Ghazali is concerned, we can ask our Ghazali scholar friend to maybe talk to us a bit more about these things, inshallah. Okay. Yes, please.
One question. Apa ni, Richard Paranas in The Passion of the Western Mind, he mentioned that Aristotle's idea of ethics is also very much constrained by his political ideas. Like for instance, his idea of Greek polis, and how only Greek citizens have the potential to have ethics.
Yes.
Whereas people living outside the city were considered to be barbarians and therefore have no possibility of having ethics.
Yes.
And even women and children also their idea of happiness is in the sense that their only recourse to happiness is to serve other people, to lead a life of contemplation.
Yes.
So perhaps these are the problems leading to the rejection or the abandonment of Aristotelian thought. What do you think about that?
You're right. As you rightly point out, because any thinker's writings need to be situated within his context and within the practice of his ideas. Because despite the brilliance that he wrote the Nicomachean Ethics, where practice is concerned, who would practice it? Who would put into act? Because as you say, where politics is concerned, he maintained the status quo. He tried to even further justify the status quo. And this is what happens even this in the history of Western thought continued to persist even until the more recent times. Yes, you get some people fighting for egalitarianism and so on, but you get this xenophobia still sometimes within their system. And if they don't do it in the system, they do it in practice like that. There is always this unbridgeable gap between theory and praxis. So that is inevitable of a system in the West, which is conceived ideally in the mind compared to what is in fact practiced. So Alhamdulillah, and we inshallah we will adjourn this session and hopefully meet again soon. Yes, let's finish with Kafaratul Majlis and Suratul Asr.